Weighing up military options against Syria, the U.S. gives its strongest response yet following a suspected gas attack that killed hundreds of civilians. The White House insists there's little doubt President Bashar al-Assad is responsible. But does the West have a mandate to attack? The U.S. has described a suspected chemical weapons attack on civilians in Syria as a moral obscenity that is inexcusable and undeniable. The question is, what is Washington and its international allies prepared to do about it? President Barack Obama put his credibility on the line last August when he said the use of chemical weapons in Syria would constitute a red line that would compel an American response. And Secretary of State John Kerry is making clear which way the United States is leaning.
The indiscriminate slaughter of civilians, the killing of women and children and innocent bystanders by chemical weapons is a moral obscenity. By any standard, it is inexcusable, and despite the excuses and equivocations that some have manufactured, it is undeniable. Last night, after speaking with foreign ministers from around the world about the gravity of this situation, I went back and I watched the videos that anybody can watch in the social media, and I watched them one more gut-wrenching time. It is really hard to express in words the human suffering that they lay out before us. As a father, I can't get the image out of my head of a man who held up his dead child, wailing while chaos swirled around him. The images of entire families dead in their beds without a drop of blood or even a visible wound. Bodies contorting in spasms. Human suffering that we can never ignore or forget. Anyone who could claim that an attack of this staggering scale could be contrived or fabricated needs to check their conscience and their own moral compass.
To our panel in a moment, but first let's get reaction from our correspondents, Fred Weir in Moscow and James Bays in New York.
There is a flurry of diplomatic activity going on behind the scenes here at the UN in New York, none of it in the chambers of the United Nations, nothing taking place in the Security Council, and I think it's pretty clear that the US now no longer wants to go down that route. It's going to ignore the Security Council because it knows Russia and China would block any military intervention. Russia and China, I think, will say that that sort of intervention would be illegal. If you listen to the words of John Kerry, I think it's clear that he's going to argue, and the US is going to argue, and the coalition that supports the US are going to argue there is a moral justification, that an international norm here has been violated and there has to be action because of it.
Even a couple of months ago, the Russians were very confident that their plan for settling the issues in Syria was the dominant one. They thought that they and the United States will rope their respective clients into a peace conference and that will lead to some sort of negotiated settlement, probably in favor of Bashar al-Assad, Russia's client, who in recent months has been winning on the battlefield anyway. And now all Russia's calculations are in tatters, and the Russians are practically frantic over what they see as a rush to war.
So let's bring in our guests. In Washington, D.C., Mark Kimmett, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs and former Deputy Director for Strategy and Plans at CENTCOM, the U.S. Central Command. Joining us from Birmingham is Hala Diab, spokeswoman for the Organization for Freedom and Democracy in Syria. And in our London studios is Toby Cadman, an international lawyer with Omnia Strategy. Toby specializes in war crimes and human rights. Welcome, all three of you. Hala Diab, from where you are sitting, does it sound as if the war drums are beating in Syria's direction, that international invasion is imminent?
I am very clear on my stand that I am against the Western intervention in Syria, because that will not solve the Syrian problem. Rather than it will escalate the situation and it will involve the region into a more regional and maybe international war. Because the involvement, any militarization of the crisis now will lead Russia and Iran and Hezbollah to feed the arm race and military support to the Syrian regime, and that can the West can be caught in a prolonged conflict that can really continue for years to come.
Is that what we're facing, Mark Kimmitt, a prolonged conflict? I mean, what we're hearing at the moment, is it a prelude to war? Has Barack Obama made the decision to go in?
Well, I don't think he's made the decision for a protracted war. In fact, the administration has been very, very careful to suggest that any response to the use of chemical weapons will be a one-off, that it has nothing to do with the wider, larger conflict within Syria, but a response to the use of chemical weapons in and of itself, and should be seen only in that context and not a prelude to a larger involvement or Western intervention.
Considering the shift in language that we're getting from the U.S. administration, is this preparing for international and American public opinion?
Well, certainly when the Secretary of State is addressing a press conference, he's not only talking to the international community, but he's also talking to the American people. He's giving them a prelude and a preview of what America may be contemplating. This shouldn't come as a surprise to the American people. Support of the American people will be necessary for this.
Toby Cadman, does this attack, what is suspected as a chemical weapons attack in Syria, does this justify some sort of interference, some sort of international interference?
Well, yes. As we're aware, there was the statement by President Obama of drawing the red line. There have been repeated statements by the British government that the use of chemical weapons would escalate matters that would then engage the international community. This is obviously a very serious escalation. We still don't know for certain whether the chemical weapons were used by the regime. We can only assume at this stage, but it does change the nature of the conflict, and certainly from my perspective, it does change the position legally for intervention. I would of course agree with Mark that what's being contemplated here is not a large-scale international military intervention, but a much shorter term bombing, potentially similar to what we have seen previously with Serbia in relation to Kosovo.
There have been other allegations in Syria about chemical weapons, and Obama responded by saying that scientific verification was needed. That's not there yet.
Well, that's correct, and certainly these questions are being asked in Washington, and as you will have seen, David Cameron has recalled Parliament for these discussions to take place with the British government. I think people are being very, very careful as to what steps are taken now, and as our other guest has stated, I mean, this is a very complex problem. It's a very it's a different conflict in terms of engaging situations in Lebanon, Iran, Israel. This is a very serious problem, and so these matters have to be very carefully weighed up to ensure that whatever steps are taken are legally justifiable.
All right, let's pick our way through some of those points that you've all raised. I mean, Syria's foreign minister told a news conference on Tuesday that accusations claiming the government likely used chemical weapons were categorically false.
We are all hearing the drums of war being beaten around us. If these countries are willing to launch an aggression or military act against Syria, I believe the pretext of chemical weapons is false, baseless and groundless. And as I said, I dare them to produce any single piece of evidence.
Hala, that's an important point, isn't it? We don't know yet who was responsible for this attack. We're not even sure what that attack was.
I want to go back to the first point that your guest said, that this military intervention is just on small scale and it within a certain context. I think any intervention in Syria now, it doesn't matter whether it is on small context or on a larger scale, it is military intervention. And even if it is based, what is the objective of the intervention of the West? Is it to get rid of the Bashar al-Assad, or is it to help Syrians to achieve democracy and freedom, or is it just because Bashar al-Assad has used chemical weapon? Before the international community to jump into a military intervention can lead to the whole country and the whole region into a regional war, there should be investigation and tangible evidence that the regime has used chemical weapon, not to base their claims on YouTube videos that have not been verified, or even on the claims of the rebels. And we have to take into consideration Russia's reaction today. It was very ambivalent. I think any military intervention in Syria will be on the interest of Russia and Iran, who want to drag the West into a face-to-face proxy war, but to take it on the ground of Syria. And in all this conversation we are hearing, people are mentioning what American people want, but nobody mentioned what Syrian people want. Syrian people who have now, we have 200,000 people dead, we have over 1.7 million refugees, over 7 million displaced. Syrian people now, they don't want to be caught in 15-year Lebanese civil war.
Okay.
They want stability, they want peace, and military intervention will not fulfill these aims of the Syrians.
Let me put one of your points to Toby Cadman. What if the investigation were to point to the possibility that rebel fighters employed these chemical weapons?
Well, that's one of the allegations that has been made. That question still needs to be determined. The position that I've taken previously, having been involved with documenting crimes and working with certain opposition groups to ensure that the question of justice and accountability is given sufficient attention. Clearly there have been crimes committed on all sides during this conflict, and it requires an international response. We don't know at this stage who has used chemical weapons. The position that has been taken, it is much more likely that they were used by the regime, but we simply do not know. These questions really have to be answered before any action is taken. In terms of whether there should be military action or not, we're 27 months into the conflict, and taking the use of chemical weapons out of the equation just for a moment, there is still justification for intervening militarily in this situation on the basis of the mounting humanitarian crisis. There is, as the other speaker has said, there's over 1 million refugees, there's close to 200,000 deaths. The question should be asked, what do we have to see in Syria before there is any action?
All right, maybe Mark can answer that. Mark, what does need to be seen? I mean, is it the act itself, or is it the amount of bodies? Well,
again, as the point has been made by both of your guests, first of all, nobody wants military intervention, but the mounting humanitarian disaster that is being seen inside of Syria begs for a response from the international community. If the international community sits back and does nothing, it's often said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And I'm very much reminded of the criticism of the international community before the interventions into Bosnia in the late 90s. The amount of killing, the amount of slaughter, the amount of carnage that went on while the world stood by. And it was only when a properly justified, properly rationalized intervention by the international community came into the former Yugoslavia did peace finally come to that region. We would all prefer that peace comes immediately to Syria. We would all like to see the killing ended. We don't want to see either Russia, Tehran, or Hezbollah become the eventual victors in there. But how much longer will the people of this world stand by while the civilians in Syria at best are sent away and at worst are slaughtered?
Let's discuss how easy or hard some sort of intervention is likely to be. Russia and China have vetoed 3 UN Security Council resolutions calling for punitive measures against Syria. So going to war without a UN mandate, it's probably not going to happen. It's legally complicated, but it has been done before. The Obama team is said to be looking at the 1999 NATO air war on Kosovo as a precedent. Back then, the US bypassed the UN Security Council and sought backing from NATO instead, using the protection of civilians as justification. NATO assembled a broad-based coalition that provided some legitimacy. If the Americans choose the same route in Syria, they could again look for backing from NATO and from Arab League countries. And there are other options the US could use. Turkey and Israel have both faced some kind of cross-border violence from Syria. They could invoke Article 51 of the UN Charter that talks about the right to self-defense if a UN member is attacked. The US could also seek a non-binding resolution from the UN's General Assembly. It wouldn't carry the same weight as a Security Council resolution, but it could provide international political cover. Toby Cadman, which direction do you think we're heading?
Well, I think everybody would agree that the best solution would be a Security Council resolution, but I think we have to be realistic that that's not going to happen. Of course, looking towards the 1999 bombing of Belgrade provides some justification. Looking towards more the mounting humanitarian crisis does provide justification. A lot of the statements that have been issued today are along the lines of, the moral compass, the morality of this requires action. There is a clear basis under international law to take action, whether it's through NATO, NATO with the Arab League, to deal with this mounting humanitarian crisis. There are differences between the situation in Syria and Kosovo. There are similarities that the same legal justification could be used. Certainly the position that's always been taken is that the ideal route would be under the United Nations, but as I said, we have to be realistic. That's not going to happen.
Mark Kimmett, are you not concerned of a preemptive response by Bashar al-Assad? We know that he has chemical weapons. He's threatened in the past that he would never use them on his citizens, but he would use it against any international interference.
Well, first of all, I think we have got to get back to the point of, did Bashar al-Assad's regime authorize the use of chemical weapons against people inside of Syria, violating his own policy, and quite frankly, yet to be determined. But
so you don't think any action will be taken unless and until that has been determined? Because we know that the UN mandate, the inspectors who are going in, all they have to prove is that there was a chemical weapon attack, but not who was behind it.
Well, I don't think anyone on this panel would agree that simply the presence or the action of a chemical attack would justify the attack on the regime of Bashar al-Assad. The fact is, there needs to be some link to the government of Syria before anybody, I believe, would contemplate authorizing a military attack on the sovereign government inside of Syria. I'm certainly no fan of the Assad regime, but unless it is determined and linked to the regime of Bashar al-Assad, and quite frankly, to a decision made by that regime, it would only fan the conspiracy theorists in the region that this chemical strike was a false flag to allow the Americans to intervene, which is the theory rampant in the region now.
Jumping in here, Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel was saying when he said that we are ready to go just like that. We've moved assets in place to fulfill and comply with whatever option the president wishes to take.
Well, that's what we call prudent military planning and prudent military operations. You don't want to wake up in the middle of the night and have the President of the United States say, we've made a decision, how long will it take you to execute that decision, and respond, sir, I need 7 to 12 weeks. Clearly what the Secretary of Defense and the military authorities have been told is, get things into position, be ready to turn them off if necessary, but ready to turn them on if the decisions are made. So I think what Secretary Hagel was reflecting is the readiness of the United States military and its allies, that if the civilian leadership makes a decision, that they're ready to execute that decision.
Hala Diab, we are hearing, this is not confirmed, though, that the Syrian opposition has handed Western powers a list of suggested targets for strike. What sort of targets do you think Syria would be concerned about, the government there?
I think that I want to go back to 2 points. First is that any intervention in Syria will not lead to a solution, and we have seen the military intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya. What is the objective of this intervention? It will not help the country. Number 2 is actually Al-Qaeda group, Jabhat al-Nusra. We have 60,000 jihadists on the Syrian ground, and that will complicate the intervention. Regarding strikes on Syria, we all know that Damascus is not like Tripoli, because Assad has actually built intelligence centers, military defenses inside residential areas. So any strike to this main point of Assad regime inside Damascus, that means that the strikes will harm people, will harm residential areas, and actually we will have more people dead, more victims than we are thinking that this military intervention will save people.
Now, we are getting hundreds of comments on our Facebook page. Letseka Rosirang tells us military intervention is not a solution. It has never been and will never be. And Young Sarah says, I think the US and its allies should hold back. More pressure should be put on the Arab League. Isolo Jihad Samabitan disagrees, saying, if I were the US president, I would have intervened long ago before all this bloodshed. And Abdallah Habayeb adds, I'm willing to ally with the devil if it's capable of alleviating my agony. There's no chance for negotiating any peaceful solution. Everyone should be fully aware of this by now. Toby, considering there are no successful precedents of intervention in the region, you can just see why it's so important for there to be a strong legal framework in place before any action is taken.
Yes, no, I'd go back to what Mark said, is that just the mere evidence of use of chemical weapons is not sufficient basis on which to act. There needs to be a very, very clear basis and a very clear, justifiable legal basis. My concern is that there has to be a long-term strategy. It's not just a matter of a short-term military action and then we withdraw. There has to be a long-term state-building process. We can see the destruction in Syria already, and all of these matters need to be considered, not just how we're going to affect this in the short term, but yes, there has to be a strong legal basis. There's been ample criticisms of the invasion in Afghanistan and Iraq, less criticism on the legal basis in Libya, more criticisms of the practicality. But certainly all of these matters need to be weighed up to ensure that this is not just a knee-jerk reaction, which comments are coming in, that this is very much a knee-jerk reaction.
Mark, if you look at all the players involved in the Syrian theatre, if you like, there have been a lot of comments from people predicting that this could be the start of the next world war. Is that a bit far-fetched, or do you agree with that?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to take a step back. What we are not contemplating at this point, what the administration is not contemplating, is a full-throated intervention as we saw in Iraq or in Afghanistan.
But regardless of the intervention, it's still an intervention of sorts.
Well, it is, but it is a response, a limited response to a violation of international norms, which is the use of one of the most heinous weapons known to man, the use of chemical weapons against civilians. That unresponded to, if no action is taken, if in fact we allow the government of, if it is proven that the government of Syria was responsible for this, and we have crossed that red line, allowing the use of chemical weapons without response, we have tripped a number of triggers that we have held in place for almost 100 years since the use of chemical weapons on the battlefields of the First World War. I believe this administration feels that a response must be necessary. To not respond to the use of chemical weapons unleashes a Pandora's box, not only in Syria, but in future uses of chemical weapons by those that don't believe that there will be a response to their use.
All right, let's end it there. Mark Kimmett, thank you very much. Hala Diab and Toby Cadman. A reminder always that you can find this program at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, and you can leave us your comments there too. Thanks very much for watching. I'm Jane Dutton. Goodbye.